The first cruel thing Sir Theobald Alderton said, that Sunday was spoken softly enough to sound charitable. Belinda Sloane heard it because she had spent most of her life listening for the damage respectable people preferred to do in lowered voices. A little gratitude would serve you better than complaint, he told the fisherman's widow beneath the yew trees outside Norcombe Parish Church. Your husband was suspected of free trading. There are patrons who may reasonably question whether parish assistance ought to continue. A few yards away, the last notes of evening worship still seemed to cling to the old stone walls. Belinda had only just slipped her mother's small boxwood pitch pipe back into her reticule after giving the parish singers their opening note. Inside the church, she had known exactly what was expected of her. Give the note, keep the tempo. Help the hesitant voices find one another. Outside, expectations became more complicated. Her father, Reverend Amos Sloane, was speaking with an elderly churchwarden near the porch. Belinda could see from his turned shoulder that he had not yet heard Sir Theobald. The widow stood before the baronet, with both hands clasped hard around the handles of a worn basket. She was not weeping. That seemed to irritate him more than tears might have done. My husband was never charged, sir, she said. Suspicion is not nothing, Sir Theobald replied, nor is reputation. Haverstock might also wish to reconsider whether the cottage should remain in your family. Belinda crossed the short stretch of churchyard before caution could persuade her to remain where a vicar's daughter was most convenient, nearby, useful, and silent. What evidence was there? She asked. Sir Theobald turned. He was a broad, carefully dressed man of 52, whose courtesy always appeared polished enough to admire until one noticed how often it left somebody smaller than before. Miss Sloane. His smile barely moved. I was speaking to your father's parishioner. Yes, Belinda stopped beside the widow, not in front of her. That is why I asked. Several people had begun to notice. A pair of county ladies paused beside the gate. One gentleman slowed while pulling on his gloves. Belinda felt the familiar pressure of attention, gathering around an impropriety too minor to name and too pleasurable to ignore. Sir Theobald's expression remained pleasant. There are matters of local order that do not improve when young ladies make a debate of them. Then, perhaps, a simple answer will prevent one. The widow's breath caught. Belinda did not look at her. She kept her eyes on Sir Theobald. What evidence was there against her husband? His smile disappeared by a degree. A vicar's daughter would do better to concern herself with hymns. The sentence landed exactly as he intended. Not loudly, not vulgarly. It told everyone listening that Belinda's usefulness ended where male judgment began. She had heard variations of it since she was old enough to sit quietly at parish dinners. Such remarks no longer surprised her. What surprised her was the voice that answered from behind the gathering. I have always thought a hymn improved by someone knowing whether the note was true. The churchyard shifted. Heads turned. A tall man stood just inside the open gate, one gloved hand resting loosely on the top of a riding crop. Mud darkened the hem of his coat and marked one polished boot nearly to the ankle, as if he had come from the road without granting himself time to become presentable for anyone. Belinda knew him before her father murmured. His Grace. Everyone in Hampshire knew the face, even those who pretended not to know the stories. Valentine Cranleigh, Duke of Norcombe, had returned from London. The whisper moved almost physically through the little company. Norcombe. The rogue. Belinda had heard the name attached to gaming tables reckless wagers, unsuitable company, and enough scandalous anecdotes to fill 3 dull winters. The man himself looked less theatrical than the reputation. His expression was composed, his dark hair wind-disordered, his gaze direct. Sir Theobald recovered first. "Your Grace, we had not understood you were expected today." That was the attraction. Valentine stepped farther into the churchyard. He greeted Reverend Sloane with a slight inclination of his head, then looked toward the widow. "Is the cottage in question on Haverstock land?" "Yes, Your Grace," she said quickly. "Then Haverstock will not remove a tenant because someone has repeated a suspicion." Sir Theobald's jaw tightened. "Surely you do not mean to interfere with parish judgment." "I mean exactly what I said about my tenant." Valentine's tone remained mild. "Parish relief is Reverend Sloane's concern with those properly responsible for it. The cottage is mine." The distinction was so precise that Belinda looked at him more closely. A careless man might have thrown rank across the whole matter and called it justice. This man had used only the authority that belonged to him. Sir Theobald glanced toward Belinda. "Miss Sloane appears determined to enlarge the question in any case." Valentine followed his gaze. For the first time, he looked at her fully. Belinda expected the easy appraisal of a man accustomed to women arranging themselves for his attention. Instead, there was a brief stillness. His eyes were grey, she thought, though the fading light made certainty difficult. Something like amusement touched them, but not at her expense. "Miss Sloane had a question," he said. "I should like to hear the end of it." Belinda became aware of everyone else only because for one odd second she nearly forgot them. The Duke had not rescued her from Sir Theobald's contempt. He had done something more unsettling. He had returned the conversation to her and waited. That waiting altered the air between them. Belinda lifted her chin. "I asked what evidence existed against the widow's husband." Valentine's gaze held hers. "A reasonable question." "I thought so." The amusement deepened, restrained but unmistakable. Belinda felt an answering warmth threaten the corner of her mouth and refused to give it too easily. Sir Theobald cleared his throat. There were reports of boats landing after dark, men moving goods inland. Her husband was seen in company that invited questions. "Seen by whom?" Belinda asked. "Names are not always useful when informants may suffer for speaking." "No," she said, "but neither are accusations when only the accused suffer for hearing them." Silence followed. This time Valentine did smile, though only briefly. Belinda understood at once that the smile was for the answer itself. Not for her boldness, not for the novelty of a vicar's daughter speaking beyond her assigned subject. He had listened. That recognition unsettled her more than admiration would have done. Reverend Sloane had joined them now. His presence relieved Belinda of nothing and steadied her all the same. "Sir Theobald," he said, "if there is evidence concerning parish assistance, bring it to me tomorrow. Until then, the widow will not be judged in a churchyard." The baronet bowed with correct stiffness. "As you wish, Reverend Sloane." He turned to Valentine. "Your Grace, Sir Theobald." No victory was announced. No one applauded. The county ladies resumed walking, with expressions suggesting they had witnessed far more than they intended to admit. Valentine stepped aside to allow the widow room to leave. His gaze returned to Belinda once, briefly. There was curiosity in it now. She suspected he found her interesting. That was dangerous enough. More dangerous was the fact that she had begun to find him difficult to dismiss. The widow waited until Sir Theobald had gone beyond the gate before touching Belinda lightly at the sleeve. Miss Sloane, she whispered. There's something I never told your father. Belinda turned. The woman's face had lost what little color it held. My husband wasn't most afraid of the revenue men. Her fingers tightened around the basket. He was afraid of gentlemen who needed poor men blamed. By Monday morning, the widow's warning had acquired the dangerous quality of a sentence. Belinda could not stop hearing. Gentlemen who needed poor men blamed. She had repeated the words to her father before breakfast, exactly as they had been spoken, and without enlarging them into an accusation. Reverend Sloane had listened with his hands folded over the edge of the table. Fear is evidence of fear, he had said. It is not evidence of guilt. Belinda had agreed. That was why, when she set out later with a basket of provisions for the widow's household, she carried no theory with her, only bread, a small parcel of tea, 2 jars of preserved fruit, and an unwilling curiosity that had survived the night. Mary Pike, the vicarage maid, walked a few paces behind with a second basket. The widow guided them along the coastal path where the land fell gradually toward a narrow strip of shore beneath the Haverstock boundary. The morning was pale and windy. Gulls turned sharply over the water, and the tide had withdrawn far enough to expose weed-dark stones and bands of wet sand. My husband used to come this way, the widow said. Not every night, not even often, but enough that I knew he was frightened of somebody. Belinda glanced at her. Did he ever name anyone? No, miss. The answer came too quickly to be dishonest, and too painfully to be complete. He said names were dangerous things when rich men had longer memories than poor ones. Belinda did not press. Ahead, the track curved around a low rise. 2 men stood near a broken section of fencing where scrub grass leaned toward the cliff edge. Belinda recognized the taller one before she recognized the dark bay gelding tethered nearby. Valentine Cranleigh had exchanged yesterday's churchyard coat for riding clothes, though the wind had already defeated whatever order his valet had imposed upon his hair. Beside him stood a broad-shouldered man in plain brown who held a leather notebook and appeared to be explaining something about the boundary posts. Valentine turned at the sound of approaching steps. His expression changed by the smallest degree when he saw Belinda. Not surprise exactly, recognition. Miss Sloane, Your Grace, she indicated the widow beside her. We are taking provisions to Mrs. Carter. Valentine bowed to the widow with none of the exaggerated gentleness powerful men sometimes used when speaking to the poor. Mrs. Carter. The steward closed his notebook. Valentine introduced him as Mr. Hales, Haverstock's steward, then glanced toward the fence. We are discovering how many things can go wrong on an estate while its owner is successfully avoiding them. Belinda looked at the leaning post. That sounds almost like an admission. I was told vicars' daughters preferred hymns to debate. His mouth tilted. I see I was misinformed. The reference to Sir Theobald might have been flirtation from another man. From Valentine, it felt more like acknowledgement. Belinda allowed herself the faintest smile. Dangerous things, assumptions. So I am beginning to learn. Mr. Hales, perhaps accustomed to his employer's manner, did not react. He explained that several markers along the lower boundary had deteriorated, and that the path near the cove had not been properly inspected since winter. Valentine's amusement faded. Then it should have been. Yes, Your Grace. There was no accusation in the steward's tone. That made Valentine's answer more telling, and I should have known it. Belinda noticed that he did not blame the steward for failing to protect him from the fact. Mrs. Carter shifted her basket. The quickest way to my cottage is along the lower shore, while the tide's out." Mr. Hales frowned toward the wet stones. "Mind the footing." They parted from the men, but the path soon narrowed where winter rain had cut into the bank. Belinda descended carefully, lifting the hem of her walking dress just enough to keep it clear of the black weed. Mary followed with the provisions. Mrs. Carter moved with the assurance of someone who had walked that shore in every season. The sea had left behind its usual disorder: shell fragments, knotted weed, a length of frayed cord, driftwood polished silver grey by salt. Belinda almost passed the darker piece lying crooked between two stones. Almost. She stopped. It was not driftwood. The fragment was thick, slightly curved, and blackened along one side with old tar. "What is that?" Mary asked. Belinda crouched without touching it. The piece looked like part of a barrel or storage cask, perhaps 2 feet in length, one end roughly broken. Along the cleaner edge were 2 deep, deliberate gouges. Near them, half obscured beneath tar and wear, was the remnant of a burned mark. Mrs. Carter went very still. "Cask wood," she said. Belinda looked up. "You are certain?" "My husband mended enough of them," she swallowed. "Not usually down here." A voice behind Belinda said, "Nor should they usually wash ashore with tar still thick on one face." Valentine had followed with Mr. Hales, apparently choosing the lower path rather than returning immediately to the estate. Belinda rose as he approached. His attention had sharpened. The easy humor from moments earlier was gone. "Do you recognize the mark?" she asked. "Not from here." He stepped closer. "May I?" Belinda moved aside, but both of them reached toward the fragment at the same instant. Her bare fingertips met his where his glove had been removed, perhaps for examining the fence. The contact was slight, no more than skin against skin over salt-dark wood, yet Belinda felt it with startling clarity. Valentine's hand stilled. His eyes lifted to hers. For one suspended second, neither of them moved. The wind seemed suddenly louder around them. His fingers were warm, despite the morning air. Belinda became acutely aware of how close he stood, of the clean line of his coat, of the restraint in a man whose reputation suggested very little restraint at all. Valentine withdrew first, not abruptly, deliberately. "Forgive me. There is nothing to forgive." Her voice remained steady, which pleased her more than it should have. He bent instead from the opposite side and examined the wood without touching her again. "2 gouges," he said, "made before the cask broke." Mr. Hales crouched beside him. "Cooper's mark, perhaps, possibly." Valentine indicated the darkened remnant near the edge. "And something branded here." Belinda studied it. Only part survived, a shallow curve, perhaps the edge of a letter, perhaps merely damage. "Can it tell us where the cask came from?" Mrs. Carter asked. "Not yet," Valentine said. The answer was immediate and careful. Belinda appreciated that. No dramatic certainty, no accusation produced to satisfy the moment. Mr. Hales suggested taking it to Haverstock for examination. Belinda looked at the fragment, then at Mrs. Carter. "I found it on the common shore while walking with her. I would like to ask some of the local people whether they recognize the markings." Valentine regarded her for a moment. "Then you should." Again, no claim of ownership, no order dressed as assistance. Mary produced an old piece of sacking from beneath the provisions, intended to protect one of the jars if it leaked. Belinda wrapped the stave carefully and tied the cloth around it with kitchen twine. She would take it to the vicarage first. From there, any movement could be deliberate rather than forgotten. Mrs. Carter led Mary onward toward the cottage, while Mr. Hales returned to the damaged fence. Belinda remained a moment longer with Valentine above the wet stones. "You knew what it was very quickly," she said. His gaze lowered to the wrapped wood in her hands. Something unreadable entered his face. Not guilt, not quite. Memory, perhaps, carrying an edge sharper than nostalgia. The shape was familiar. From estate stores. He gave a short breath that might once have become a joke. This time it did not. No. He looked toward the grey line of the channel, then back at her. "I used to know exactly what such casks carried." By Wednesday afternoon, the broken stave lay exactly where Belinda had placed it 2 days earlier, wrapped in sacking on a narrow table beside her father's study door. And no amount of passing it had made its presence less troublesome. She had asked 2 fishermen whether the twin gouges meant anything to them. Neither had recognized the mark. Reverend Sloane had advised patience. Mrs. Carter had offered no further name. The wood remained only what it had been when Belinda lifted it from the shore. A fragment, a possibility, and a question no one yet had the right to answer with certainty. Valentine Cranleigh arrived shortly after 2 o'clock in a dark carriage bearing the Norcombe crest, accompanied as far as the vicarage door by a groom who remained outside with the horses. Reverend Sloane received him in the small drawing-room where afternoon light fell across faded curtains and shelves that held more sermons than ornament. Belinda was already there, with a mending basket at her side, though she had not put a needle through cloth for several minutes before the Duke was announced. Valentine entered with none of the theatrical ease gossip had taught her to expect from a celebrated rogue. He bowed to her father, then to Belinda. "Reverend Sloane, Miss Sloane." His gaze rested on her for an instant longer than ceremony required. "I hope I'm not disturbing parish business." "At present," Reverend Sloane said, "the most urgent parish business is whether my daughter intends to mend that cuff or merely judge it." Belinda looked down at the untouched sleeve in her lap. "I had nearly decided it deserved to suffer." Valentine's mouth curved, a stern parish, only toward badly behaved linen. His laugh was quiet, and Belinda realized with some surprise that she had wanted to hear it. That realization made her reach for the needle at once. Reverend Sloane noticed nothing, or kindly pretended not to. He asked Valentine whether the lower boundary, inspection, had revealed anything useful. Enough to prove that neglect accumulates, even when one has excellent people employed to prevent it, Valentine said. "Mr. Hales has begun a proper review." He did not disguise the failure as his stewards. Belinda remembered that from Monday. She remembered, too, the warmth of his fingers against hers over the blackened stave, and was annoyed by how clearly memory preserved such an insignificant thing. Valentine glanced toward the study door. "Is the piece of cask still here?" "Wrapped beside Father's study," Belinda answered. "No one has identified it." "Good." She raised an eyebrow. "You are relieved by ignorance." "I am relieved nobody has invented certainty merely because uncertainty is uncomfortable." It was close enough to her own thought that she looked at him more sharply. Valentine met her gaze. "You said on Sunday that accusations are not useful when only the accused suffer for hearing them." Belinda went still. He had remembered the sentence almost exactly, not merely its meaning, its shape. "You have an inconvenient memory, Your Grace, only for things worth remembering." The words were lightly spoken, but the amusement in his eyes was different from the practiced charm she had seen him use with others. Belinda felt warmth rise beneath her composure. She lowered her attention to the cuff. "That sounds dangerously like flattery." "Then I shall withdraw it at once." I have a reputation to maintain, so I have heard. He laughed again. This time she let herself smile openly. For a few moments, the room became easier. Then Reverend Sloane asked the question Belinda had been avoiding since Monday. You told my daughter you once knew what such casks carried. Valentine's expression changed. The humor did not vanish so much as close like a door. I did. Reverend Sloane waited. He had spent 30 years encouraging confessions from people who mistook silence for condemnation. Belinda knew the power of that patience. Valentine appeared to recognize it as well. He looked toward the window, where the vicarage garden sloped gently toward a hedge bright with late spring green. French brandy, most often, sometimes lace, tobacco, tea, depending upon who was bringing what and where. Belinda set the cuff aside. You saw such cargoes yourself? Yes, his answer was immediate, no evasion, and bought them. A pause followed, but not a dishonest one. Yes, Reverend Sloane leaned back. Belinda watched Valentine's hands. They remained loosely clasped, his posture controlled. Only the stillness around his mouth suggested that the admission cost him anything. I was younger, he said, which is an explanation of age, not character. I gambled more than was sensible. I kept company with men who considered consequence a tedious occupation for other people. Untaxed French brandy was fashionable because buying it felt daring when one possessed enough money that very little danger actually reached one. Belinda studied him. Did you think it harmless? I thought almost nothing about it. There was no pride in the answer. That was part of the harm. Outside, a cart passed along the lane. The ordinary sound of wheels over packed earth seemed strangely loud in the quiet room. Belinda asked, "Why did you stop?" Valentine's eyes returned to hers. For an instant, she saw the old instinct rise in him, quick and polished. Perhaps I developed an unexpected affection for paying duties to the crown. Belinda did not smile. She simply waited. The joke died between them. Valentine looked down once, then back at her. There, that is what I do. Make jokes. Before anyone can ask whether the truth is uglier. Reverend Sloane said nothing. Belinda did not rescue Valentine from the silence he had chosen to enter. After several seconds, he continued. I did not know him well. Men in my circle used him, and others like him, when they wanted goods moved from shore to road without troublesome questions. I bought from them. I drank what came through their hands. I treated the entire business as entertainment. His voice had become quieter. Then revenue officers made a serious sweep along the coast. The titled gentleman disappeared back to London. The fisherman could not. He lost his boat for a time, then his work. His family nearly lost their cottage. I remember one of my friends complaining that the brandy at dinner tasted inferior that winter. Belinda felt something cold settle beneath her ribs. And that was when you understood? It was when I first stopped pretending not to. What happened to the fisherman? I do not know enough to make myself look better by telling you. Valentine's jaw tightened. I arranged money through an intermediary because I was ashamed to put my name to it. Whether it repaired anything, I cannot honestly say. Soon afterward, I stopped buying contraband. Eventually, I stopped keeping most of the company that made such things amusing. Eventually, Belinda repeated. Yes, he accepted the word without defense. I am not going to turn a late improvement into an early virtue. Reverend Sloane's expression softened, though not into absolution, and the cove. Haverstock's lower shore was known to me in those years. I visited it with men I should not have trusted. I did not organize landings. I did not own the trade. but I knew what happened along stretches of coast like ours, and I benefited from pretending the difference mattered more than it did. Belinda thought of Mrs. Carter standing beneath the churchyard yews. She thought of men with money returning to London, while men with boats remained behind to carry blame. The stories about Valentine had always been told as glittering sins: gaming, brandy, daring company. Improper night, made harmless by distance and time. He was showing her their underside. It was less romantic. That made his honesty more compelling, not less. Then perhaps the question is not whether the stories are true, she said. Valentine looked at her. It is what you became after they were. Something in his face changed. Not relief. Relief would have been too easy. It was closer to recognition. You do not offer absolution cheaply, Miss Sloane. I did not realize you had asked for it. His eyes warmed. There is the inconvenient precision again. Belinda picked up her cuff at last. You are free to stop remembering my sentences. I suspect I shall fail. Reverend Sloane rose then, saying he must speak with the churchwarden before supper. But he left the drawing-room door fully open and instructed the housemaid to bring fresh tea. The propriety of the arrangement was so deliberate that Belinda nearly smiled. Valentine noticed the small boxwood pitch pipe lying near her reticule. Is that what you used on Sunday? Yes. She lifted it carefully. Its wood had darkened with years of handling, one edge polished smoother by her mother's thumb and then her own. It belonged to my mother. His expression gentled. She taught music. Only enough to prevent parish singers from beginning in 3 different keys. Belinda turned the little pipe between her fingers. She used to say that giving the first note did not mean singing for everyone. You offered the note. They had to find their own voices. Valentine was silent. Beyond the open window, a bird called once from the hedge. I think, he said at last, your mother understood more than music. Belinda closed her fingers around the pitch pipe. She usually did. His gaze remained on her, steady and unguarded now. On Monday, the tarred stave had made his past dangerous. By Wednesday, Belinda understood why. If contraband were found anywhere near Haverstock, society would not need a lie to suspect Valentine Cranleigh. It would need only the truth about the man he had once been. Friday morning brought a hard blue sky, a restless sea, and the uncomfortable certainty that the cask stave had become too important to leave, lying beside Reverend Sloane's study door. Belinda carried it herself, still wrapped in the same piece of sacking. Mary had tied around it on Monday, while her father walked at her left, and Valentine Cranleigh rode slowly beside them until the ground, narrowed enough that he dismounted. Mr. Hales, the Haverstock steward, waited ahead near the lower boundary with a ring of estate keys and a folded plan tucked beneath one arm. No one had identified the twin gouges. No one had explained the burned mark beneath the tar. That should have made the fragment less troubling. Instead, each unanswered question seemed to give it greater weight. Reverend Sloane glanced at the bundle in Belinda's hands. You have carried that as though it might confess if properly intimidated. I have tried patience, she said. It has been remarkably stubborn. Valentine, walking on her other side now, looked at the stave. Perhaps it has heard that confession is dangerous in a vicar's family. Only when guilt is involved. Then I shall be extremely cautious. Her father's mouth twitched. Belinda looked toward Valentine and found him watching her with that same restrained amusement he had shown in the drawing-room 2 days earlier. It was becoming disconcertingly easy to recognize when his humor was offered as companionship rather than defense. She reminded herself that one honest conversation did not make a man trustworthy. Unfortunately, it did make him more difficult to dismiss. Mr. Hales greeted Reverend Sloane and Belinda before explaining what the estate men had found since Monday. Several lower posts had rotted through. One section of fencing had fallen toward the cliff path. More concerning was the narrow track leading from the upper pasture toward Norcombe Cove. The ruts were recent enough to have survived the last rain. Valentine's attention sharpened. Cartwheels? Likely, Your Grace. Not heavy estate wagons. Something narrower. And do we use that track? Not ordinarily. The fishermen sometimes bring nets up by hand, but there is no regular Haverstock cart traffic there. Belinda looked toward the path. Then someone has been using it. Mr. Hales answered carefully. Someone, Miss Sloane. We do not yet know who. Valentine glanced at her. I see my steward has adopted your religion. Evidence before certainty, a severe doctrine. You appear to need one. Reverend Sloane coughed into his hand, though Belinda suspected no illness. Valentine lowered his head, as if accepting correction from a magistrate. I shall endeavor to survive it. The path descended through tough grass toward a narrow cove cut into the coast below Haverstock land. Families from the parish sometimes gathered seaweed there or repaired nets along the higher stones. At the far end stood a low timber boathouse, grey with weather and half sheltered by a rise of chalk and scrub. Belinda had seen it from a distance but had never approached closely. The place looked abandoned until one noticed the small signs that abandonment did not explain. Fresh scuffs marked the earth outside. A length of rope had dragged across damp ground, leaving a shallow groove. One hinge on the outer door showed bright metal where rust had recently been disturbed. Valentine stopped several yards away. The change in him was immediate. He did not joke. He did not move forward. For one strange moment, the Duke of Norcombe looked not powerful, but arrested by memory. Belinda watched him without speaking. Reverend Sloane did the same. At last Valentine said, I should have had this place secured years ago. Mr. Hales turned toward him. It has not been listed for regular use since before I became steward, Your Grace. That is not your failure. Valentine's gaze remained on the boathouse. It is mine. Belinda shifted the wrapped stave against her palms. Why was it left? His answer did not come immediately. The wind pressed his coat against his shoulders. Because I disliked coming here. That seems a thin reason for an estate decision. It is. He looked at her then. There was no irritation in his face, only the weariness of a man who had already made the same accusation against himself. I came here when I was younger, not every landing, not every season, but enough. Men I knew thought the cove private and convenient. I thought it amusing that Haverstock land could be useful in ways my father would have despised. Reverend Sloane's expression remained calm, and afterward, I stayed away. Valentine looked back at the old structure. I told myself disuse was the same thing as correction. It was easier to shut the door on a place than to ask what neglect might permit. Belinda followed his gaze. The distinction mattered. His past had not merely left him ashamed. His shame had created an empty space in the present, and empty places invited other people's uses. Then, your history is not only a story someone might tell about you, she said. It altered what you failed to see. Valentine met her eyes. Yes, the single word held no defense. Mr. Hales unlocked the outer door. Inside, the boathouse smelled of salt, damp timber, and old rope. There were no casks, no bundles, nothing that proved current smuggling, yet several boards near the back wall had been swept more recently than the rest, and one hook bore fibres from rope too clean to have hung there for years. Belinda unwrapped the stave and held it where the light from the open door could reach the gouges. Mr. Hales examined the mark, but shook his head. "Not one I know from Haverstock stores." "Which tells us very little," Belinda said. "Only that it is not immediately familiar." Valentine looked at her. "There is that severe doctrine again." She almost smiled. "You are learning. Against my nature." Reverend Sloane walked toward the doorway, studying the track beyond. If carts have come down recently, the upper turn may show more. They left the boathouse and followed Mr. Hales toward the track. The easiest route crossed a strip of loose shingle where the ground sloped sharply. Reverend Sloane and the steward went ahead by a firmer line nearer the grass. Belinda placed one boot carefully, then another. Pebbles shifted beneath her sole. Valentine stepped down first, turned and extended his hand. He did not touch her, he merely offered it. Belinda stopped. The gesture should have been ordinary. A gentleman assisting a lady over uncertain ground was nothing remarkable, yet the memory of Monday's accidental contact returned with disobedient clarity. This was different. Then their fingers had met by chance, and Valentine had withdrawn first. Now his palm was open between them, and the choice belonged entirely to her. His expression held no teasing. "May I?" he asked. Belinda looked at his hand, then at him. "You may." She placed her hand in his. His fingers closed carefully around hers, firm enough to steady and no more. The warmth of his hand moved through her glove, with an immediacy she had not expected. Valentine stepped backward once, giving her room rather than pulling her forward. Belinda descended the loose stones. For 3 measured steps, they were connected by nothing more dramatic than balance and trust. When her boots reached firmer ground, he released her at once. The loss of contact was strangely distinct. "Thank you," she said. "You are welcome." His voice sounded quieter than before. Neither mentioned the moment again. Mr. Hales had crouched near the track. He pointed to 2 shallow grooves pressed into the damp earth. "These are recent." Reverend Sloane joined him. "From the same cart?" "Impossible to say." Mr. Hales rose and looked back toward the boathouse. "But there is something else, Your Grace. I asked the undergardener who sometimes cuts across the upper pasture. He passed here last Thursday morning." Valentine's face hardened with attention. "And?" The boathouse door was standing closed, but the latch was hanging loose on the outside. Belinda frowned. "Meaning?" Mr. Hales looked toward the weathered building below them. "Meaning someone had unfastened it from inside, sometime before he passed. By Monday evening, the tarred stave was back at the vicarage, still wrapped in the same sacking, and still refusing to become anything more useful than a fragment of unanswered trouble." Belinda had spent the intervening days thinking about the unfastened boathouse door, the recent wheel marks above Norcombe Cove, and Valentine's admission that shame had kept him from supervising the very place where his younger recklessness had once flourished. None of those facts proved present wrongdoing. They did, however, make the invitation to dine at Alderton House feel less innocent than it might have a week earlier. Reverend Sloane said as much while their modest carriage turned beneath the Alderton gates. "We are guests tonight, Belinda, not investigators. I know. Your expression suggests you know with unusual reluctance. I shall ask no one whether they have recently hidden French brandy beneath the dining table." Her father gave her a patient look, a promising beginning. Alderton House stood several miles inland, its pale stone front arranged to give the impression that nothing disorderly had ever happened beneath its roof. 2 carriages already waited near the entrance. A third had just been drawn toward the side drive, where servants were unloading travelling trunks under the supervision of a groom. Belinda would have looked away if one wheel had not caught her attention. A pale crust marked the lower spokes and bodywork above the rim, uneven and granular, where damp had dried. Salt. She knew the look from parish carts that had gone too near the shore in windy weather. Yet Hyacinth Alderton, who had supposedly spent the previous days making inland calls among relatives, had no obvious reason for her carriage to carry sea salt. One servant grunted as he and another lifted a trunk. It was smaller than Belinda expected for the effort required. The groom hissed something under his breath and glanced toward the house. Belinda lowered her eyes before he noticed her watching. Reverend Sloane had already reached the steps. Belinda, coming. She followed him inside, carrying the observation with her and refusing to turn it into a conclusion. Hyacinth received them in a drawing room bright with candles and pale blue silk. She was beautiful in the accomplished way of a woman trained from childhood to understand the exact effect of posture, color, and silence. Her gown was ivory with a narrow blue sash, her dark hair arranged without a single visible rebellion. She greeted Reverend Sloane warmly and Belinda with courtesy that stopped just short of friendship. "Miss Sloane, I'm pleased you came. Thank you for inviting us. Father insists the county becomes provincial if the same 6 people dine together every week." Sir Theobald, standing near the hearth with 2 neighbouring gentlemen, smiled as though the remark reflected charming household wit rather than his own strategy. A man must protect civilization where he can. Valentine arrived moments later. The room altered around him before anyone said his name. Belinda disliked that she noticed his entrance as quickly as everyone else. He wore evening black with immaculate white linen, every inch the Duke of Norcombe, rather than the mud-marked rider from the churchyard. Yet, when his gaze found hers, the formality softened. "Miss Sloane, Your Grace, Reverend Sloane." Valentine exchanged proper greetings with the room, including Hyacinth, who received his attention with practiced ease. Sir Theobald watched them together. Belinda saw the watchfulness and understood at once that Hyacinth's expectation was not merely social. Her father intended the Duke to notice her, perhaps to choose her. Hyacinth herself smiled when Valentine spoke, but when Sir Theobald remarked that a settled household improves even the most adventurous gentleman, something tightened around her mouth before she concealed it. Dinner confirmed the pattern. Sir Theobald placed Valentine where Hyacinth could engage him easily, and Belinda several seats away beside a retired colonel who believed parish poverty resulted chiefly from poor planning. She listened until he announced that fishermen ought simply to save more during prosperous months. "Some do," Belinda said. "Others lose a week of work to weather, then another to damaged nets, while still owing rent and provisions." The colonel waved one hand. "Which proves my point. A prudent household prepares." Another gentleman joined him. "People along the coast have always found means of supplementing honest work." The implication was obvious. Smuggling. Valentine, who had been answering Hyacinth's question about London, looked across the table. Sir Theobald seized the opening. "Norcombe knows something about that old coastal ingenuity, if half the stories are true." A faint amusement moved among the men. Belinda saw Valentine's expression change by almost nothing. Sir Theobald continued. "There was a time when your grace knew every landing place between here and the Needles, or so we were told." "We were told many things," Valentine said. "Most became better stories through repetition. But not all false stories." Theobald lifted his wine. "Come, you were young. A little French brandy, a little moonlight, a little excitement beyond the reach of respectable dullness. No one at this table proposes to condemn a gentleman for having once been entertaining." Hyacinth's hand around the stem of her glass, Belinda remembered Valentine sitting in the vicarage drawing-room, saying that titled gentlemen returned to London while fishermen remained to bear the consequences. She wondered whether he would laugh. Now he did not. "The difficulty," Valentine said, "is that respectable dullness was seldom the person punished when revenue arrived." The amusement around the table faded. Sir Theobald tilted his head. "You have become severe, only less easily entertained by consequences that belong to someone else." Hyacinth looked at him then with something more complicated than disappointment. Fear, perhaps. Her father's glance touched her briefly. She lowered her eyes at once. The retired colonel cleared his throat. "Still, coastal families often know perfectly well what they're doing." "Some do," Belinda said. "Some are also indebted to men with greater means and fewer risks." Sir Theobald turned toward her. "You speak with confidence, Miss Sloane." "I speak with acquaintance. My father serves those families." "Acquaintance is not expertise." One of the neighboring gentlemen murmured agreement. Belinda felt the familiar narrowing of the room. Her knowledge could be useful in a cottage, comforting beside a sick bed, respectable when distributed quietly through parish work. At a gentleman's table, it became impertinence the instant it challenged assumption. Before she answered, Valentine spoke. "Miss Sloane knows them. Why are we asking men who do not?" Silence followed, brief but sharp. Belinda looked across the candles. His gaze met hers. There was no rescuing triumph in it. He had not declared her correct, merely because he admired her. He had asked the room to recognize who possessed relevant knowledge. Sir Theobald's expression cooled. The colonel studied his plate. Valentine added, almost lightly, "Dangerous things, assumptions." Belinda went still. The phrase was hers, spoken outside Haverstock a week earlier. He remembered. Again, something warm and unwilling moved through her. His mouth curved at the corner when he saw recognition in her face, and she understood that he knew exactly what he had done. Hyacinth saw it too. Belinda caught the instant her attention moved from Valentine to herself. Not jealousy, not yet. Calculation mixed with distress. The conversation shifted toward county subscriptions, then to roads and tenant improvements. Sir Theobald mentioned an expected expense and Hyacinth's marriage prospects in the same careless breath. A daughter properly settled makes one concern easier, at least. Hyacinth's fork touched her plate with a tiny metallic sound. "Father." "What?" Every father thinks of these things. Not every father discusses them between the fish and the roast. She smiled, but colour had risen beneath her composure. Sir Theobald laughed too loudly and turned the subject. Belinda watched Hyacinth lower her glass without drinking. For the first time, the beautiful daughter of Alderton House did not look like a rival placed elegantly in Valentine's path. She looked like someone standing where she had been instructed to stand and afraid of what would happen if the arrangement failed. Later, as the ladies withdrew, Belinda passed a window overlooking the side drive. Below, servants were carrying the last of the travelling trunks inside. Hyacinth paused beside her. For one heartbeat, Both women looked down. Hyacinth's face changed. She stared at the salt-streaked carriage wheel and the heavy trunks, not with vanity, annoyance, or curiosity. She looked at them with unmistakable fear. Thursday afternoon settled over the vicarage with a warmth that made the garden smell faintly of box hedge, dry earth, and the roses Reverend Sloane insisted survived mostly because no one interfered with them. Belinda had spent the morning telling herself that the dinner at Alderton House had changed nothing. Hyacinth's fearful glance toward the salt-streaked carriage proved no crime. The heavy trunks proved no crime. Valentine's remembered phrase across the dinner table proved only that he listened, which was troublesome in an entirely different way. By the time his carriage stopped before the vicarage, shortly after 3, Belinda had decided she would be composed, sensible, and immune to the fact that she recognized the sound of his arrival before Mary announced him. Reverend Sloane received Valentine in the drawing-room and kept him there long enough to discuss parish subscriptions, a damaged footbridge, and the weather with the deliberate thoroughness of a father who understood both propriety and human impatience. Only after tea had been served did he permit Belinda and Valentine to walk in the front garden, where the study windows stood open and he remained visible at his desk inside. The arrangement was respectable enough to satisfy the parish, and private enough to allow conversation without 6 other people deciding what it meant. Valentine walked beside Belinda at an unhurried pace. He wore no expression of practiced charm. That alone warned her that whatever had brought him was not light. "You were quiet when we left Alderton House," he said. "I thought I had spoken several times." "You did." His mouth moved. "Then I should say you were quiet in the way that usually means you are thinking something inconvenient." "For whom?" "I have not yet discovered." Belinda looked ahead. Sunlight shifted across the gravel path beneath the leaves. Miss Alderton seemed distressed by her father. "Yes, and by something outside the window." Valentine glanced at her. "You noticed that too?" "I noticed her face. I do not know what caused it. You are very determined not to know anything before you know it. You make that sound exhausting. I suspect it is one reason I find speaking with you restful." The words were gentle enough to unsettle her. Belinda refused to reward them with visible confusion. "That is a curious definition of rest. Most people permit me to lie to myself for their comfort." His tone changed slightly. "You do not." They had reached the far edge of the front garden, where the hedge gave a partial view of the lane. Reverend Sloane remained at his desk behind the open window, near enough to preserve propriety and far enough to grant them silence. Valentine stopped. Belinda did the same. "There is more," he said. She knew immediately what he meant. "About the smuggling, about me." He looked toward the hedge rather than at her. "On Wednesday, I told you the version that was easiest to admit without actually lying. I bought contraband. I kept foolish company. Poorer men suffered consequences that men like me escaped. All true." Belinda waited. His hands were behind his back, clasped more tightly than usual. "What did you leave out?" she asked. Valentine breathed once before answering. "That I sometimes knew exactly when goods were coming ashore." Belinda felt the words settle between them. He continued before she could speak. "I did not organize the landings. I did not own boats. I did not pay crews. But there were evenings when men I knew sent word that a shipment had arrived. We rode down to meet them. We drank from bottles before the casks were moved inland. We treated the whole thing as theatre." He gave a short, humorless laugh. "The rich pretending at danger because actual danger belonged to someone else. Belinda thought of Mrs. Carter, of the unfastened boathouse door, of salt on carriage wheels. And Haverstock Cove? I was there more than once. Did anyone use your name? Valentine looked at her now. Yes, the answer was stripped bare. Not in writing, so far as I know, but enough that a fisherman or groom could say he had His Grace's permission and expect fewer questions. I did not object. Sometimes I encouraged it, because I thought it amusing that a title could frighten a customs man at a distance. Belinda's stomach tightened. That is worse than buying brandy. Yes, he did not defend himself. I know, the steadiness of that answer made anger more difficult, not less. Belinda turned away and walked several paces before stopping beside a rosebush that had grown wild beyond its support. She did not touch it. Why tell me now? Because you are beginning to trust me. His voice came from behind her, quiet but clear, and I will not accept trust purchased by omission. She faced him. You might lose it, I know. You say that as if it costs nothing. Something shifted in his expression then. Not wounded pride, fear, real and quickly controlled. It costs more than I expected. Belinda's breath caught despite herself. Valentine looked away first. That is another truth I would rather make into a joke. She said nothing. He forced himself to continue. When I inherited Norcombe, I told myself I had changed because my life looked different. Fewer gaming houses, better company, more estate business. I paid debts. I dismissed men I should never have employed. I stopped buying contraband. He glanced toward the road beyond the hedge. But I never returned properly to the cove. I never asked what remained there, because I did not want to see the place where I had been ridiculous and cruel at once. So you left the boathouse unused by me. Belinda understood the distinction, and perhaps useful to someone else. Perhaps, he exhaled slowly. That is what I mean when I say I cannot ask you to believe I was innocent. There it was, not confession designed to obtain forgiveness, not tragedy arranged to make his guilt beautiful. Simply a man placing an ugly fact between them and refusing to decorate it. Belinda looked at him for a long moment. Redemption is not innocence. Valentine's gaze lifted to hers. No, it does not erase what happened. No, and regret is not the same thing as repair. His jaw tightened, but he nodded. No. Belinda heard her mother's voice in memory, not as words but as habit. Give the first note. Do not sing the rest for them. Valentine had spent years allowing other people to repeat the worst stories first, so that no one could surprise him with shame. He had mistaken confession for punishment and punishment for change. Now he stood before her without performance. Then perhaps what matters, she said, is whether you are willing to repair what still can be repaired. His expression changed with painful slowness. I am. Even if no one applauds, a trace of his old wit surfaced. Especially then. I am becoming suspicious of applause. Belinda almost smiled. Good. Silence stretched between them, warmer now, but not easier. Valentine's eyes dropped briefly to her hands, then returned to her face. He made no movement toward her. That restraint mattered more than she wished it did. Belinda realized she wanted to offer something in return for honesty, but not absolution. Not yet. Something smaller, something true. She extended her hand. Valentine stared at it. For the first time since she had met him, he looked completely uncertain. Belinda, he said softly, forgetting the formal Miss Sloane. The intimacy of her name in his voice sent a quiet shiver through her, but she did not withdraw. Take it, he did. His fingers closed around hers, with the same care he had shown on the shingle 2 days earlier. But this time neither of them was crossing dangerous ground. They simply stood together beneath the afternoon light, her hand resting in his, the contact steady and chosen. Valentine did not tighten his hold. Belinda did not pull away. Several breaths passed, then several more. "This is not forgiveness," she said. "I know. It is not a promise, I know." She looked at him. "What is it, then?" His thumb did not move. His hand remained still around hers. "More than I deserve." Belinda's fingers tightened once in answer. "Do not decide what I am permitted to give." Valentine's eyes warmed, and something vulnerable moved through his face before he mastered it. Very well. He looked down at their joined hands, then back at her. "Then I will call it what it is. And what is that? Trust enough for today." Belinda held his gaze. Yes, they remained that way until Reverend Sloane shifted a stack of papers inside the study, a small domestic sound that reminded them both where they stood. Belinda released Valentine's hand first. The warmth of his fingers remained after the contact ended. Neither of them joked about it. 2 days later, everything Valentine had confessed would become the very reason half the county was ready to believe him guilty again. By Saturday morning, Haverstock Park had gathered half the county beneath one roof for what was supposed to be a respectable coastal subscription breakfast, and Belinda understood before the second pot of coffee was poured that respectable gatherings were often most dangerous when everyone believed nothing important could happen there. The long breakfast room stood open to a terrace, overlooking the lower lawns, and beyond them the pale line of the sea. Clergymen, landowners, magistrates, merchants, and several ladies concerned with parish relief moved between tables laid with bread, ham, eggs, preserves, and silver coffee urns. Reverend Sloane had come to discuss subscriptions for fishermen's families during bad weather. Belinda had come because her father had asked her to keep several household lists in order, and because refusing the invitation would have looked more pointed than accepting it. Valentine had greeted them near the entrance with formal courtesy. Nothing in his manner referred to Thursday afternoon, to her hand in his, or to the words he had spoken with such painful honesty. That restraint affected her more than any private acknowledgement might have done. Across the room, Sir Theobald Alderton held court beside a window, while Hyacinth stood near her father in pale green muslin, composed enough that only someone watching carefully would have noticed how often her gaze moved toward the terrace doors. Belinda watched carefully. She could not help it now. The salt-streaked carriage, the heavy trunks, Hyacinth's fear, the recent tracks above Norcombe Cove, the unfastened boathouse. None of it formed a complete picture. She was determined not to force the pieces together, merely because they seemed eager to meet. Valentine approached while Reverend Sloane spoke with a neighboring rector. "You look as though you are counting crimes instead of subscriptions," he said quietly. "I am counting assumptions, more dangerous, often." His mouth curved, but there was tiredness beneath the expression. Belinda wondered whether he had slept. "Are you regretting the breakfast?" she asked. "Not yet. You sound disappointed." "I have been told I thrive on disaster, by people who mistake surviving one for enjoying it." Valentine's gaze settled on her. The look was brief, but something in it recognized the conversation they were not having. "You are becoming unfairly perceptive, Miss Sloane. I had excellent teachers." Before he could answer, the footman at the door hesitated. The hesitation was small. The effect was not. 2 men entered in dark coats, accompanied by Mr. Hales. Their clothes were practical rather than fashionable. their expressions grave. The steward went directly to Valentine. Conversation began to thin around the room. "Your Grace," Mr. Hale said, low enough to preserve courtesy but not privacy. "These gentlemen are revenue officers from the district. They have received information concerning the Lower Cove." Valentine's face did not change. "What information?" the older officer answered. "Anonymous notice of contraband stored on Haverstock property, specifically the unused boathouse." Belinda felt the room tighten. Sir Theobald turned from the window. Hyacinth went very still. Reverend Sloane was suddenly beside Belinda. Valentine glanced once toward the terrace, then back to the officer. "You wish to inspect it?" "We do, Your Grace." A lesser man might have protested rank, demanded paperwork, delayed for dignity's sake. Valentine did none of those things. "Then inspect it." The officer inclined his head. "We would prefer you or your steward present. Mr. Hales and I will both attend." Several gentlemen began exchanging looks. Sir Theobald spoke before anyone else could. Surely this need not disturb the entire morning. His tone was mild, almost helpful. "If it is merely some foolish rumor, discretion would protect everyone concerned." Valentine looked at him. "If it is foolish, daylight will not injure it." Theobald smiled without warmth. "As you wish." Reverend Sloane touched Belinda's sleeve. "You should remain here." She nodded. There was no reason for her to go to the cove. The cask stave was still at the vicarage, exactly where she had left it. What happened next would not depend upon her carrying a fragment of wood into the room like a dramatic answer. Yet waiting proved harder than she expected. The breakfast broke apart into whispering groups. Some guests left their plates untouched. Others pretended to discuss parish accounts while listening for footsteps. Hyacinth moved closer to the window. Belinda saw her press 2 fingers briefly against the table edge as though steadying herself. Sir Theobald did not go to her. He remained among the gentlemen, patient and composed. Less than an hour later, Mr. Hales returned first. He did not need to speak for Belinda to know the search had found something. His face had the stunned pallor of a man whose ordinary duties had suddenly acquired consequences. Valentine entered behind him with the revenue officers. The older officer addressed the room because secrecy was no longer possible. Untaxed French brandy and several bundles of lace have been found concealed within the Haverstock boathouse. A murmur swept the breakfast room. Someone whispered, "Good God." Another voice said, "Norcombe." Belinda looked at Valentine. He stood perfectly still, not cold, not defiant, simply controlled. Theobald broke the silence with exquisite reluctance. "This is deeply unfortunate." Valentine turned toward him. "Yes, especially given what is already known." The words fell softly, that made them more effective. Several faces shifted toward Valentine. Sir Theobald continued, as if pained by the necessity of memory. "No one wishes to be cruel, Your Grace, but you have never concealed that you once purchased illicit brandy. You knew this cove. You knew the men who used such places, and now contraband is discovered in your own boathouse." Every fact was true. Belinda knew that because Valentine himself had told her. That was the horror of it. A lie could be attacked at its weakest point. Truth arranged maliciously was harder to touch. Valentine said, "My past conduct is true. My involvement in this cargo is not." One gentleman near the hearth frowned. "Then how did it come to be there?" "I do not know." The answer caused another stir. Theobald gave the smallest sigh. "That is the difficulty." Hyacinth looked at her father. Her face had gone pale. Belinda saw it. No one else seemed to. A county patroness turned suddenly toward Belinda. Miss Sloane. The room followed her gaze. Belinda's stomach tightened. The lady continued, "You have spent considerable time in His Grace's company these past weeks. Your father's household is respected by everyone here. Surely you can tell us whether you believe this accusation impossible." It was a trap wrapped in compliment. If she defended Valentine, her father's good name became evidence. If she refused, society would hear condemnation. Belinda looked across the room at him. Thursday returned with painful clarity. "I cannot ask you to believe I was innocent." His hand around hers. "Trust enough for today. Not forever, not blindly." Valentine's eyes met hers. He did not plead. That almost undid her. The patroness pressed gently. "Miss Sloane," Belinda drew one breath. "I know what His Grace has told me." The room quieted. "I know that he has been honest about conduct in his youth that does him no credit. I also know that he denies any part in the goods found today." The woman leaned forward. "And do you believe him?" Belinda could feel Reverend Sloane beside her, steady and silent. She looked at Valentine, not the room. "I will not pretend to know what I do not." The silence that followed was immense. Someone shifted near the coffee urn. Sir Theobald's eyes sharpened with satisfaction. Belinda felt the cost of her own words immediately. She wanted to say more. She wanted to tell him Valentine had confessed before anyone forced him, that he had not hidden the ugliness of his past, that he had changed in ways she had begun to trust. None of it proved who had placed French brandy in the boathouse. Love, or whatever dangerous thing was beginning between them, could not become permission to manufacture certainty. Valentine's expression did not harden. Instead, something quiet passed across his face. Respect, perhaps even relief. He turned to the room before anyone could make Belinda answer again. "Miss Sloane owes me no defense." The words were calm, but they carried to every corner. "My reputation is mine. My past is mine, and whatever has been found on my estate is for me to answer, without borrowing a woman's conscience to make the answer easier." The patroness colored. No one spoke. Valentine looked at the revenue officer. "You will have access to whatever you require." "Thank you, Your Grace." Sir Theobald folded his hands. "A wise decision." Valentine did not dignify that with a reply. The breakfast ended not long afterward, though no one officially declared it finished. Guests departed in clusters, already shaping the morning into a story. On the terrace, Reverend Sloane paused to speak with a rector, leaving Belinda several paces away. Sir Theobald approached him before she could join them. His voice was low, but Belinda heard enough. "You have served this parish honourably for many years, Sloane. It would be regrettable if patrons began to question whether contributions were being administered by a household too closely associated with Norcombe's difficulties." Reverend Sloane's face became very still. "Are you threatening parish subscriptions because my daughter answered a question honestly? I am warning you how the county thinks." Belinda looked past them toward Valentine standing with Mr. Hales near the far doors. For the first time since she had met him, his old reputation was no longer merely a story about the man he had been. It had become a weapon in someone else's hand. By Sunday morning, the scandal at Haverstock had already travelled farther than any carriage leaving the estate. It reached Norcombe Parish Church before the first bell. It arrived in lowered voices beneath bonnets, in greetings that stopped too quickly, in gentlemen who suddenly found Reverend Sloane's opinion less necessary than it had been the week before. Belinda noticed all of it because nothing sharpens observation like becoming the subject of people determined not to look directly at you. She stood beside her father near the vestry door. After service, while a parish patron explained, with elaborate regret, that his promised contribution to the Fishermen's Relief Fund must be postponed. Only until matters become clearer, the man said. Reverend Sloane's expression remained courteous. The hunger of a fisherman's child is rarely improved by clarity, Mr. Wetherill. The gentleman coloured. I don't mean to punish anyone. No one ever does, Belinda said quietly. He looked at her and then away. By noon, 2 more promised subscriptions had been withdrawn. Neither patron mentioned Valentine by name. Neither needed to. Sir Theobald's warning at Haverstock had become action without ever becoming an order anyone could prove he had given. Worse, several fishermen who had previously spoken freely to Reverend Sloane now avoided the vicarage. Mrs. Carter came after luncheon with her shawl drawn tightly around her shoulders despite the mild weather. Men are frightened, miss, she told Belinda in the small parlour. Not of revenue exactly, of losing work, of landlords hearing they've talked, of being called smugglers because they once carried a parcel for the wrong man. Has anyone threatened them? Belinda asked Mrs. Carter hesitated. Not in words they'd swear to. There it was again. Pressure that remained respectable because it preferred implication to proof. Reverend Sloane joined them from his study. Mrs. Carter, tell the men this much. If they know nothing, I expect nothing. If they know something and choose silence from fear, I will not call them cowards, but no one should invent a story merely because the county is hungry for one. Mrs. Carter nodded. After she left, Reverend Sloane closed the parlour door and looked at his daughter. There is another matter. Belinda knew from his tone that she would dislike it. Sir Theobald, indirectly. He sat opposite her. Lady Merton called this morning. She believes your continued association with Norcombe may be interpreted as your father's household endorsing him before the inquiry has even begun. I have endorsed nothing, I know. I refuse to say he was innocent. I know that too. Belinda rose and walked to the window. The vicarage garden looked offensively peaceful. What does Lady Merton suggest? That you avoid Haverstock. Avoid being seen with his grace. Allow the matter to resolve itself. Belinda turned. And if he is guilty, then distance would protect you. And if he is innocent? Reverend Sloane did not answer. Belinda folded her hands before her because she suddenly wanted to pace. Then distance would protect me while leaving him alone with a lie. Possibly. Father. Belinda, I am telling you what was said, not commanding you to obey it. The distinction mattered. It steadied her anger. She sat again. There are 2 stories being offered to me. In one, I prove loyalty by declaring Valentine innocent because I care for him. Reverend Sloane's eyes lifted at the name, but he said nothing. In the other, I prove respectability by abandoning him because society has become suspicious. And you believe both are dishonest. I know they are. Her father watched her for several moments. Then what will you do? Belinda thought of the black-tarred stave still wrapped beside the study door. She thought of the salt dried along the Alderton carriage, Hyacinth's frightened face, the recent tracks above the cove, and Valentine standing before an entire breakfast room, refusing to borrow her conscience. I intend to discover what is true. Reverend Sloane's expression changed, not into surprise, but recognition. Then discover only what can be discovered. I will. And do not confuse courage with walking alone into places where sensible people take witnesses. That pulled a small smile from her. You do have a gift for removing romance from moral purpose. It is one of the duties of a father. Valentine came to the vicarage the following afternoon, Monday, the 9th of June, but he did not ask to see Belinda privately. Mr. Hales accompanied him, and Reverend Sloane received both men in the drawing-room with the door open. Belinda entered only after Mary brought tea. Valentine rose when she appeared. The restraint between them was immediate and painful. On Thursday she had held his hand. On Saturday she had refused to clear his name. Now neither event could be acknowledged without turning the other into something it was not. "Miss Sloane," he said. "Your Grace." She took her usual chair. Mr. Hales unfolded several estate memoranda on the table, none of them removed from Haverstock records, merely brought for discussion. Valentine addressed Reverend Sloane first. "I have informed the revenue officers that they may inspect the cove, the boathouse, and any Haverstock estate record relevant to its use. Mr. Hales will provide access without requiring my permission each time." Reverend Sloane nodded. "That is sensible. It is overdue." Valentine looked toward Belinda then. "I have also instructed Mr. Hales that no Haverstock tenant, fisherman, labourer, groom, or servant is to lose employment or a cottage merely for giving truthful information." Belinda felt something inside her ease, despite herself. "Even if that information is damaging to you, especially then." Mr. Hales confirmed it without drama. His Grace's instruction is explicit. Belinda studied Valentine. There was no performance in his face, no expectation that she reward the decision with belief. "Sir Theobald's influence reaches beyond Haverstock," she said. "I know. Men may still fear creditors, other landlords or employers. I know that too." He rested one hand lightly against the back of the chair beside him, but did not sit again. "I can only remove the pressure that belongs to me. I will not pretend that is the same thing as removing all of it." That answer affected her more than reassurance would have done. "And what do you intend to do next?" she asked. A shadow of the old Valentine appeared. "My instinct, if it is printable, ride to Alderton House and ask Sir Theobald why he looked so unsurprised on Saturday." Reverend Sloane's brows rose. Valentine continued, "Which is precisely why I shall not do it." Belinda almost smiled. "Progress. Painful progress." He looked at her. "The revenue officers will examine what is theirs to examine. Mr. Hales will answer for the estate. I will answer questions about my own conduct." He paused. "I will not ask you to investigate for me." Belinda's spine straightened. "I did not intend to." "Good." There was no offense in the word, "nor will I ask what you mean to do." She held his gaze. "Why not?" "Because if you choose to seek truth, it must remain your choice. And because I have already spent too much of my life believing that wanting an outcome gives me the right to arrange how everyone else reaches it." The silence that followed was not romantic in any easy sense. There was no touch, no private tenderness. Yet Belinda felt the distance between them change. On Saturday, she had denied him certainty. On Monday, he returned the gift by refusing to demand her loyalty. Valentine bowed to Reverend Sloane and then to her before leaving with Mr. Hales. At the doorway, he stopped only long enough to say, "Whatever you discover, Miss Sloane, I would rather hear an unwelcome truth from you than a comforting lie." Then he was gone. Belinda remained seated until the sound of the carriage faded down the lane. Her father gathered the untouched teacups. "You are thinking?" "Yes." "Inconveniently?" She looked toward the study door. The same sacking-wrapped stave lay on the narrow table where she had left it, unchanged, unclaimed, still carrying its 2 deliberate gouges beneath the tar. "Very." Reverend Sloane followed her gaze. "Do you have an idea?" Belinda rose and crossed to the fragment. "A cooper made those marks." She placed one hand lightly on the wrapping without opening it. Perhaps it is time to ask one whether he remembers doing so. On Wednesday morning, Belinda carried the wrapped cask stave out of the vicarage with more care than she would have given a valuable possession, though it belonged to no one in the household and had cost them nothing but trouble. Reverend Sloane walked beside her, and Mary Pike followed several paces behind. Her father had insisted on both arrangements. "If we are going to ask questions," he had said over breakfast, "we shall do so in daylight, in company, and without behaving as though common sense were an obstacle to truth." Belinda had agreed without argument. The cooper they sought worked from a low timber yard beyond the village, where the air smelled of fresh-cut oak, damp hoops, and wood shavings. Mr. Hale, a square-handed man in his late 40s, listened without interruption, while Reverend Sloane explained that they wished only to know whether the marks on a broken stave meant anything to him. Belinda placed the wrapped fragment on his workbench and untied the same kitchen twine Mary had fastened around it on the shore more than 2 weeks earlier. The wood had not changed. The old tar still darkened one face. 2 deliberate gouges remained near the cleaner edge. The partial burned mark showed only where weather and salt had allowed it. Mr. Hale bent over it. He did not touch it at once. "Where did you find this?" "Below the Haverstock boundary," Belinda said, "near Norcombe Cove." His eyes lifted briefly. "Recently, on the 26th of May. Reverend Sloane added, "We are not asking you to accuse anyone." "Good, Mr." Hale picked up a small rag, rubbed only enough grit from the edge to see the cuts, then stopped. Belinda noticed his face change. "You recognize them," she said. "I recognize my own bad habit." He reached for a mallet handle lying nearby and showed them 2 shallow notches cut near its base. "I make a double gouge on storage casks when a customer orders enough that I need to keep one batch separate from another. Not proper branding, just a working mark for myself and the lads." Belinda looked back at the stave. "You made this? Likely. For whom?" Mr. Hale hesitated. That hesitation mattered more than a quick answer would have done. "I would need to be careful." "Please be careful," Belinda said. "I would rather have a small truth than a large mistake." The cooper studied her, then nodded. He turned the stave toward the light. Near the edge of the tar lay the burned remnant they had been unable to identify. Mr. Hale wet one thumb and rubbed lightly at the dirt beside it, exposing no more than was already there. "That curve is not mine. The cellarmen burned it after delivery." Reverend Sloane leaned closer. "Whose cellar?" "Alderton House." The words landed without drama. Belinda felt a quick tightening in her chest all the same. "You are certain?" "Certain. I supplied a run of oak storage casks there last autumn with this pair of gouges." He tapped beside the marks. "Sir Theobald Stewart wanted a cellar brand burned in as well. An A inside a partial ring. That looks like what is left here." Belinda looked at the broken mark. Now that he had named it, she could see the suggestion of the letter. It was still incomplete, still not enough to prove anything about smuggling. "How many casks?" Reverend Sloane asked. "A dozen, perhaps 14. Wine storage, I was told. Some for brandy already legally purchased through merchants. Nothing improper in the order itself." Belinda nodded. "So this proves only that an Alderton cask, or part of one, reached the shore." "If it is one of mine, yes," Mr. Hale frowned. "It does not prove who carried it there." "No," Belinda said, "and we must keep that distinction." The cooper appeared relieved. He described the order once more, this time slowly enough that Reverend Sloane could remember the details without turning the conversation into a formal statement. Belinda rewrapped the stave herself. Mr. Hale had cleaned only the surface needed to inspect marks. Nothing had been cut, scraped away, or altered. The fragment left his yard in the same possession in which it had arrived, Belinda's. They had nearly reached the vicarage when they found Mrs. Carter waiting beside the gate. She twisted the edge of her shawl between both hands. "Miss Sloane, may I speak with you?" Reverend Sloane answered gently. "You may speak with both of us if you wish." Mrs. Carter looked toward Mary, then toward the road. Inside, perhaps. They took her into the small parlor. The wrapped stave remained on Belinda's lap rather than returning immediately to the table beside the study door. Mrs. Carter stared at the sacking. "You found where that came from, didn't you?" Belinda did not answer too quickly. "A cooper believes it came from a cask supplied to Alderton House. That does not tell us who brought it to the shore." Mrs. Carter shut her eyes briefly. "My husband moved casks for them." Reverend Sloane's voice remained calm. "For whom, precisely? Not Sir Theobald himself. Not to his face." She swallowed. "An Alderton groom came to my husband last winter. Said there was easy money for moving sealed casks inland from a lower track. No questions. My husband did it twice." "Did he know what was inside?" Belinda asked. "Not the first time. Maybe not the second either. He told me later he thought it was drink." He stopped when the groom asked him to go nearer the cove after midnight. Her hands tightened. That was when he started saying gentlemen needed poor men blamed. Reverend Sloane leaned forward. "Would you tell this to Revenue?" Fear crossed her face immediately. "I don't know." Belinda saw exactly why Valentine's promise mattered. No one should force you. Mrs. Carter looked at her. "If I speak, men will say my husband was a smuggler." "Some may, and if I don't," Belinda glanced down at the wrapped wood. "Then that must still be your decision. Truth obtained by frightening you into it would not be clean truth." Mrs. Carter's eyes filled, though she did not cry. "I need time." "Take it." By late afternoon, the stave was once again wrapped and resting beside Reverend Sloane's study door. Belinda had not sent for Valentine. She had not needed to. Mr. Hales arrived at the vicarage on estate business shortly before 5, and Reverend Sloane asked him to tell His Grace that Belinda had learned something relevant, and would speak with him if he wished to call properly. Valentine came before supper, accompanied to the door by a groom, and received in the drawing room with Reverend Sloane present. Belinda told him everything. The cooper's working mark, the Alderton cellar brand, the limited value of the connection, Mrs. Carter's account of the groom, her fear. Valentine listened without interruption. When Belinda finished, he remained silent long enough that she wondered whether anger had taken hold. Then he said, "I will not use Mrs. Carter's statement unless she chooses to give it." Belinda watched him closely. "Even though it may help clear you?" "Yes, even if Sir Theobald uses the delay against you." "Yes." His voice was firmer now. "I spent too many years benefiting from the fact that men like her husband carried risks for men like me. I will not clear my name by making his widow carry another one." Something inside Belinda shifted. Not relief, something quieter and more dangerous. Trust returning because it had been given a reason. Valentine looked toward the wrapped stave beside the study door. "And the wood?" "Still here, mister. Hale examined it, and I brought it back." "Good." He met her eyes. "You have done more than I had any right to ask." "You did not ask." "No." The faintest trace of warmth entered his expression. "I am learning." Belinda rose to place the tea tray nearer her father. As she passed Valentine, she stopped. The movement was so instinctive she understood it only after it had begun. She rested 2 fingers lightly against the sleeve at his wrist. Not his hand, not a promise. A deliberate touch, brief and unmistakably hers. Valentine went still. "I know," she said softly. His gaze dropped to her fingers, then returned to her face. He did not turn his wrist beneath them. He did not prolong the contact. "Belinda," he said, equally quiet, "I will not ask you to clear me." Her fingers remained there for 1 heartbeat more. "That is why I am beginning to believe you may be worth clearing." Then she withdrew her hand. Across the room, Reverend Sloane became very interested in rearranging papers that did not need rearranging. Valentine's expression held no triumph, only something almost tender and carefully restrained. Before either of them could speak again, Mary appeared at the drawing-room door, carrying a folded visiting card. "Miss Sloane," she said, "this was brought from Alderton House." Belinda took it. The message was from Hyacinth Alderton. It contained only one request. She wished to call at the vicarage privately, but properly accompanied, and she begged Belinda not to refuse her. Hyacinth Alderton arrived at the vicarage on Friday morning in a carriage. Belinda recognized at once, though the salt had been scrubbed from the lower bodywork, and the wheels now looked almost offensively clean. Her maid descended first. Then Hyacinth stepped down in a dove-grey walking dress, her face composed enough for any passerby and pale enough that Belinda knew the composure was costing her something. Reverend Sloane received both women in the drawing-room. Mary remained within easy call, and Hyacinth's maid sat near the window with folded hands. Nothing about the visit could be called secret. That seemed to matter to Hyacinth. She stood for several seconds after the first formalities, as if afraid sitting would make it harder to leave. Belinda did not rescue her from the silence. At last Hyacinth said, "I asked to come because I think you already know enough to make ignorance impossible." Reverend Sloane indicated the chair opposite Belinda. "Then perhaps you should tell us what you believe we know." Hyacinth sat. Her gloves remained on. "The carriage." Belinda answered carefully. "I saw salt on it. I saw heavy travelling trunks. That proves the carriage had been near the coast. Nothing more." A bitter little smile touched Hyacinth's mouth. "You are very inconvenient, Miss Sloane." "So I have been told. Most people would make the accusation first and wait for facts afterward. That usually makes the facts nervous." Hyacinth gave a breath that was almost a laugh, then looked down at her hands. The trunks contained French lace. Reverend Sloane's expression remained still. Belinda felt the words settle into place with the other clues. "Untaxed?" she asked. "Yes." Hyacinth closed her eyes briefly. "My father has been moving goods inland for months. Brandy as well. I do not know every landing. I do not know every man involved. But I know the carriage has been used because I was told to lend it for journeys I did not make." "And you agreed," Belinda said. Hyacinth looked at her. "At first, I told myself there was no real harm. Rich women bought French lace whether duties were paid or not. Gentlemen drank French brandy and laughed about it. My father said everyone profited except revenue." "Did you believe him?" "I wanted to." The honesty of that answer was more useful than remorse performed beautifully. Then one of the fishermen refused a journey. Hyacinth continued. His debt was mentioned. His cottage was mentioned. His daughter's place in service was mentioned. Her fingers tightened beneath her gloves. Nothing was said that could be called a threat if repeated before respectable people. Belinda thought of Sir Theobald beneath the churchyard yews. "He prefers implication." "Yes." Hyacinth's voice thinned. He has always preferred making other people explain why they were afraid. Reverend Sloane asked, "Why Haverstock Cove?" Hyacinth went still. This was the part she had dreaded most, because of his grace. Belinda felt a quiet pressure beneath her ribs. "Because of Valentine's past?" Hyacinth nodded. "My father said if contraband were ever discovered there, no one would need convincing. The Duke had once bought smuggled brandy. He had used the cove. Everyone knew he had been reckless. Father said, the cleverest falsehood is the one that does not require anyone to lie." Belinda's anger sharpened, but not because Hyacinth's words were surprising. They confirmed what had already become possible. "The anonymous notice to revenue? My father arranged it. You saw him do so?" "No, he told me after the Haverstock breakfast that the matter had gone as expected." Belinda held her gaze. "Then say only what you know directly when you speak to revenue." Hyacinth stared at her. "When I speak to them, if you intend to. I came here because I thought you would tell me what to do." "No." The answer was immediate. Hyacinth flinched. Belinda softened her tone without changing it. "I will tell you what I believe. I will not decide whether you confess." "You think I should?" "Yes, and if it destroys me, it may cost you." Belinda leaned forward slightly. "Being frightened explains a choice. It does not erase it." Hyacinth's face tightened as though struck by something invisible. Her maid looked down. Reverend Sloane remained silent. After a long moment, Hyacinth whispered, "I know." Belinda believed her then, not because Hyacinth wept, which she did not, but because she stopped defending herself. "There is another landing," she said. "Wednesday." Belinda's pulse quickened. "The 18th? Before dawn. My father ordered the travelling carriage prepared. He said there would be packages to move inland before breakfast." "Where?" "I do not know precisely. The carriage is to wait above the Haverstock track. That is what the coachman was told." Reverend Sloane asked, "Who else knows?" "My father, the men involved, possibly the groom who arranges the trunks. I do not know whether His Grace's name has been used again." Belinda's thoughts moved quickly, but she forced herself not to race ahead of proof. "Will you tell this to revenue officers?" Hyacinth looked toward the window, then back at Belinda. "Yes." Her voice trembled once and steadied. "I will tell them about the carriage, the lace, my father's instructions, what I heard, what I did, and what you did not see," Belinda said. "Yes, good." Hyacinth's expression twisted. "You do not mean I am good?" "No." The answer surprised both of them. Belinda continued, "I mean it is good that you will tell the truth." Hyacinth nodded slowly. "That is fair." She rose, then hesitated. "Miss Sloane, I thought I hated you." Belinda blinked. "That seems an unfortunate conclusion from such limited acquaintance. I thought if the Duke preferred you, everything my father had demanded of me would become useless." Hyacinth gave a small, exhausted smile. "It took me longer than it should have to realize that I was angry at the wrong person. And now I am mostly angry at myself." Belinda stood. "That feeling is useful only if it changes what you do next." Hyacinth looked at her for a long moment. "You and His Grace are well suited." Heat rose unexpectedly into Belinda's face. "This is perhaps not the moment." "No," Hyacinth said, and almost smiled. "But I suspect there may never be a safe one." She left with her maid shortly afterward, taking nothing from the vicarage except the consequence of her own decision. By late afternoon, Valentine arrived after Reverend Sloane sent a brief note asking him to call. Belinda told him everything Hyacinth had permitted to be shared. She watched his face as she explained the carriage, the packages, the planned Wednesday landing, and Sir Theobald's deliberate use of Haverstock, because Valentine's old reputation would make guilt believable. Valentine did not curse. He did not demand horses. He did not order Mr. Hales to seize anyone. He stood beside the drawing-room hearth and became very still. "Revenue must handle the landing," he said. "If we interfere too early, Theobald will only change the route." Reverend Sloane nodded. "Hyacinth is willing to speak." Then she should do so without anyone from Haverstock coaching her. Belinda heard the discipline in that answer. "You do not intend to confront Sir Theobald?" "I intend many things." Valentine looked at her. "I shall do fewer." Her mouth nearly curved. Painful progress. Cruel woman. The humor faded almost at once. Reverend Sloane excused himself to write a letter in his study, leaving the drawing-room door open as always. Valentine and Belinda remained within full propriety, yet the quiet between them suddenly felt more intimate than privacy. "There is something I have not said," he told her. Belinda waited. "You may discover that I was worse than I have remembered, or that some man says, as I gave permission I no longer recall giving, or that the truth clears me of this and still leaves you with a man whose past is not clean enough to love." Belinda's breath caught. He looked away. "That is the fear I have been avoiding. Not prosecution, not gossip. You, Valentine." He looked back at her. "I do not want you to comfort me because I have finally learned to tell the truth. I know, and I will not ask you to promise what Wednesday may change." "I know that too." He took one slow breath. The uncertainty in his face was more vulnerable than any confession he had given her. "May I hold you?" Belinda felt the question move through her with startling tenderness. He did not reach for her. He waited. She crossed the distance herself. Yes. Valentine opened his arms only when she stepped close enough to make her choice unmistakable. Belinda placed her hands against his coat and let herself rest there. His arms came around her, carefully, one across her back, the other higher at her shoulder, warm and steady without possession. For a few quiet moments, neither spoke. Belinda heard his breathing. She felt the restraint in the way he held her, as though he understood that being permitted closeness did not grant him any right beyond the permission given. She tightened her arms around him. Valentine exhaled against her hair. "That," he murmured, "was not required. Do not decide what I am permitted to give." He gave a soft, helpless laugh. "I remember." Belinda drew back first, but only far enough to look at him. His hands released her immediately. The tenderness in his face remained. No kiss followed. Neither of them tried to turn comfort into certainty. Valentine glanced toward Reverend Sloane's open study door, then back to her. "Before Wednesday, I need to do one more thing." "What?" "Tell Revenue the part of this story only I can tell." Sunday passed beneath a silence so taut that even the ordinary sounds of the parish seemed sharpened by what Wednesday might bring. Valentine did not come to the vicarage. Belinda knew from Reverend Sloane that he had gone with Mr. Hales toward the Revenue Office in the Lymington district, carrying no letter of influence, no appeal to rank, and no expectation that anyone there should treat the Duke of Norcombe as anything except a man whose property had been used for contraband. The knowledge unsettled her more than his presence might have done. It would have been easier to admire him while watching him behave honorably. Instead, she had to trust that he would do so when she was not there. Late that afternoon, Reverend Sloane found her in his study, looking at the tarred stave where it still lay wrapped beside the door. "We should decide what happens to this tomorrow," he said. Belinda touched the sacking lightly. "It must go to Revenue." "Yes." with Mr. Hale's identification and Mrs. Carter's account, if she still wishes to give it. Her father nodded. She came by while you were with Mary in the kitchen garden. She has decided she will speak. Belinda looked at him quickly. Freely, I asked twice, and she said fear had already decided enough things for her. Belinda exhaled slowly. Then we should go with her. We shall. Monday morning dawned clear and cooler. Reverend Sloane arranged a hired carriage large enough for Belinda, Mrs. Carter, and himself, while Mary remained at the vicarage. The cask stave travelled wrapped exactly as before, on the floor between Belinda's feet. It had been found by her, kept at the vicarage, examined by the cooper, returned to her possession. And now it would leave that possession deliberately. She was absurdly conscious of the transfer. Objects became dangerous when people forgot where they had been. Mrs. Carter sat rigidly opposite, her hands locked together. You need only say what you know, Belinda reminded her, not what anyone wishes you knew. Mrs. Carter nodded. His Grace said the same, not to you. He has not spoken to you about this. No. The widow looked out the window. That makes it easier. At the Revenue Office, matters were conducted without spectacle. The same older officer who had attended Haverstock received them. Belinda placed the wrapped stave on his table and told him where she had found it on the 26th of May. Reverend Sloane explained that the local cooper had recognized the twin gouges as his working marks and the partial brand as consistent with a run of storage casks supplied to Alderton House. Belinda repeated the limitation as carefully as she had before. It does not prove who carried the cask to Norcombe Cove. The officer nodded. Quite right, Miss Sloane. Mrs. Carter then gave her account in her own words. She described the Alderton groom, the sealed casks, the payments offered to her husband, and the pressure that followed when he became reluctant. No one supplied phrases for her. No one asked her to claim that Sir Theobald had spoken directly when he had not. By the time she finished, her voice was trembling, but her facts had not changed. The officer asked whether she would be willing to repeat the statement if required. Mrs. Carter glanced once at Belinda, then answered for herself. Yes, I'm frightened, but yes. When they left, the cask stave remained behind. Belinda looked back at the office door after it closed. The fragment was no longer at the vicarage. It was no longer hers to carry. That seemed important. The truth had begun to move beyond private rooms. Valentine returned to Norcombe later that afternoon. He came directly to the vicarage after first stopping at Haverstock long enough to change horses and leave Mr. Hales with estate business. Reverend Sloane received him in the drawing-room. Belinda entered a few minutes later and knew at once that his journey had cost him something. He looked composed. That was the first sign. Valentine usually wore composure as lightly as wit. Today it sat upon him like armor. Your Grace, Reverend Sloane said, we delivered the stave. Mr. Hales told me you meant to. Valentine looked at Belinda. And Mrs. Carter? She gave her statement voluntarily, Belinda said. Only what she personally knew. Good. He sat only after Reverend Sloane invited him. Then we have all done what we can before Wednesday. Belinda studied him. What did you tell Revenue? Valentine met her gaze. There was no hesitation. Everything I could remember that belonged to me. Reverend Sloane remained still. Valentine continued. I told them I knowingly purchased untaxed spirits in my 20s. I told them which sections of Haverstock Cove I used to visit and the names of men I associated with where memory was reliable. I told them that others sometimes used my name as social cover and that I did not object. Belinda felt the same cold ache she had felt when he first confessed, but it no longer surprised her. And the boathouse. I told them I neglected it afterward because I was ashamed to return there. I also told them I had no knowledge of the present cargo until it was discovered. Did they believe you? They listened? That was not my question. A faint shadow of humor touched his face. No, it wasn't. He leaned back slightly. I do not know what they believe, nor should I decide it for them. Reverend Sloane's eyes warmed. That may be the wisest thing you have said in this room. A devastating judgment, sir. Belinda almost smiled, but Valentine's expression sobered again. There were facts I could have omitted without technically lying. I did not omit them. Why? She asked, though she knew. He looked directly at her. Because if Wednesday clears me, only after I have hidden the most damaging parts of my past, then I will have learned nothing. The room grew quiet. Belinda understood then what had changed. His redemption was no longer a confession made to her because her opinion mattered. He had told men who could use his admissions against him. He had surrendered control of the story without knowing whether the story would be kind. Reverend Sloane rose after a few minutes, saying he had parish correspondence to finish. As always, the drawing-room door remained open. Valentine glanced toward the garden. Would your father consider it scandalous if we walked where he can still see us? From the study doorway, Reverend Sloane answered before Belinda could. I have survived greater scandals this week. The front garden held the mild gold of late afternoon. Belinda and Valentine walked without speaking until they reached the box hedge near the open study window. There he stopped. You know now what I told them. Yes, and you still may learn something on Wednesday that changes your judgment of me. Yes, his mouth curved faintly. You have a remarkable talent for refusing convenient reassurance. You said you preferred unwelcome truth. I did. I was clearly reckless even in reform. That earned the smile he wanted, but it faded when Belinda said, Valentine, you told them things that may deepen the scandal. I know. You could have waited until after Wednesday. That would have meant telling the truth only after it became safe. His eyes held hers. I have done enough safe repentance. Something in Belinda gave way then. Not caution, but the last argument she had made against believing that his change was real. This is the first time, she said softly, that I fully understand what you mean by redemption. Valentine did not move closer. Belinda, her name in his voice carried no claim, only hope restrained by fear. May I kiss you? Her heart beat once, hard enough to make the world seem briefly still. She knew what he was asking and what he was not. Not forgiveness, not a promise about Wednesday, not absolution for the man he had been. Only this, her choice, she said. Valentine waited. That mattered too. Belinda crossed the remaining distance herself. She lifted her face, and he bent toward her only when her intention was unmistakable. Their first kiss was gentle, brief, and warmer than she had imagined. There was no urgency in it, no possession, only the startling tenderness of finally allowing affection to become visible. When they parted, Valentine remained close enough that she could see the uncertainty still in his eyes. Belinda did not retreat. Do not make a joke, she whispered. I wasn't going to. Good, his smile came slowly. I was thinking I may never recover. That was nearly a joke. A very small relapse. She laughed softly, and the sound loosened something in both of them. Valentine did not kiss her again. He did not need to. 2 days remained before the expected landing at Norcombe Cove, and for the first time Belinda understood that whatever happened there, what stood between them had ceased to depend upon innocence. It depended upon truth. Before dawn on Wednesday, the 18th of June, Norcombe Cove lay beneath a thin grey light that made sea and sky difficult to separate. Belinda waited above the lower track, with Reverend Sloane and Hyacinth Alderton inside a small Haverstock estate shelter used in bad weather by shepherds and boundary men. None of them had been permitted nearer the cove while revenue officers took their positions. Valentine had not argued for Belinda to accompany him below. He had not argued to accompany the officers either. He and Mr. Hales remained where instructed on the upper ground, far enough from the boathouse to avoid disturbing whatever might come ashore. That restraint cost him. Belinda could see it each time she glanced toward him through the half-open door. He stood with his coat buttoned against the morning chill, one hand resting loosely at his side, watching the dark line of the water without moving. Hyacinth sat rigidly on a wooden bench. Her maid remained beside her. "The carriage should have been brought down before sunrise," Hyacinth whispered. "If father has changed the arrangement, it may not come." Belinda looked at her. "Then you have still told the truth. That will feel less useful if no one believes it." Usefulness is not the measure of whether it was right. Hyacinth gave a strained breath. "You do have a terrible talent for saying things that are difficult to argue with. It saves time." Reverend Sloane looked toward the cove. Quiet. They heard it then. Not voices. Wheels. Faint at first, then clearer along the upper track. A carriage emerged from behind the rise, its lamps hooded, followed by a smaller cart. Even in the uncertain light, Belinda recognized the Alderton travelling carriage, the one whose salt-streaked wheels she had watched from a window 16 days earlier. Hyacinth closed her eyes. "That is ours." No one moved toward it. The revenue officers waited. Below, a low boat approached through the pale water. Then another. Men stepped into the shallows and began carrying casks and tightly wrapped bundles toward the boathouse. Belinda could not hear every word from the shelter, but she saw the pattern clearly. Goods moved from boat to shore, from shore toward Haverstock's neglected building, from building toward the track where the Alderton carriage waited. No story was being manufactured now. The movement itself told it. One of the men rolled a cask toward the boathouse door. Another lifted a bundle of lace into the rear of the carriage. Only then did the revenue officers emerge. The interruption was swift, controlled, and more frightening for its lack of drama. Men shouted in surprise. One attempted to retreat toward the boat and stopped when an officer barred the path. Another dropped a bundle into the shingle. No shots were fired. No one was struck. Orders were given. Names demanded. Goods secured. Valentine remained where he had been told to remain. Belinda watched him closely. The man who once would have ridden straight into danger simply because someone forbade it, now stood still while lawful authority did its work. Sir Theobald Alderton appeared less than 10 minutes later in a hired gig driven hard down the upper track. Whether he had been following the carriage or summoned by a lookout, Belinda could not tell. He climbed down before the vehicle had fully settled. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded. The older revenue officer, who had received Belinda's stave, stepped toward him. "It means, Sir Theobald, that untaxed goods have been observed landing at Norcombe Cove and being moved toward your carriage." Theobald looked past him and saw Hyacinth standing outside the shelter. His face altered. "You." Hyacinth went pale but did not retreat. "Yes, father. Go home." "No." It was the first time Belinda had heard her speak that word to him without apology. Theobald's gaze snapped toward Valentine. This is your land. It is. Valentine descended the last few yards of the track only after the revenue officer signaled that the site was secure, which is one reason I intend to answer every question put to me. Convenient. Sir Theobald's voice sharpened. A notorious smuggler discovers contraband on his own estate, then points at someone else. I have pointed at no one. You expect these men to believe you have suddenly become respectable? Valentine's expression did not change. No. The answer silenced even Theobald for a moment. A revenue man rolled one of the newly seized casks into clearer light. Its wood was fresh and intact. Near the upper hoop were two shallow gouges. Above them, burned into the oak, was an A within a partial ring. Belinda felt Hyacinth's breath catch beside her. The older officer sent another man to the cart above the track. He returned carrying a wrapped object Belinda recognized immediately. The half-tarred stave. It had remained in revenue custody since Monday. It had not returned to the vicarage. Now the officer unwrapped it on a flat packing board and placed it beside the newly seized cask. The old fragment was broken and weathered. The fresh cask was intact. They were not the same object, yet the twin working gouges aligned in style and spacing, and the remnant of the burned cellar brand on Belinda's stave matched the complete Alderton mark on the seized cask. Mr. Hale, the cooper, identified these marks before today, the officer said. His account has been recorded. Theobald stared at the wood. Casks are sold. Marks travel. Certainly, Belinda said. Every face turned toward her. Reverend Sloane remained at her side as she stepped only as far forward as propriety and safety allowed. That is why the old stave alone did not prove who moved it to the coast. Sir Theobald's mouth tightened. Then you admit it proves nothing. Alone, yes. Belinda looked toward the Alderton carriage, where revenue officers had begun removing bundles of French lace. But it is no longer alone. Hyacinth stepped forward next. Her voice shook once. The carriage has carried lace before. Theobald turned on her. Be silent. No. Her chin trembled, but she lifted it. You ordered it. You told me the Duke's old reputation would make Haverstock the safest place to hide the goods because everyone would believe him guilty before they looked farther. You ungrateful fool. Reverend Sloane moved one quiet step nearer Hyacinth, not touching her, only making it impossible for her to feel isolated. One of the detained men then spoke from beside the boathouse. Sir, she's telling it true. Theobald stared at him. The man swallowed. Alderton men paid us, said debts would be remembered if we refused. Carter refused after 2 runs. That's when they started saying he was unreliable. Another man nodded reluctantly. Same with me, Mrs. Carter was not present at the cove, but her voluntary statement already existed in revenue hands. Now others were corroborating the pressure she had described. Theobald looked from the officers to the carriage, to his daughter, and finally to Valentine. And you think this absolves you? He demanded. Everyone here knows what you were. You bought smuggled brandy. You used this cove. You let men trade on your name. Valentine's face became very still. Belinda knew before he spoke that he would not avoid the blade simply because it was aimed at him. Yes, Theobald blinked. Valentine continued. I bought untaxed spirits. I came to this cove when I was young. Men used my title as protection, and I allowed it because I thought consequence was something that happened to poorer men. No one moved. I have already told revenue those facts. I told them before this landing because I would rather be judged with the whole truth than cleared by a convenient half of it. Sir Theobald gave a harsh laugh. Then you confess yourself guilty of my past conduct. Yes, Valentine's gaze did not leave him, not of yours. Belinda felt something inside her settle with absolute clarity. She stepped forward. I never claimed. His Grace was innocent of his past. Theobald turned toward her. Then you have proved my point. No. Her voice carried farther than she expected in the open air. It proves why evidence matters. His reputation made your accusation believable. It did not make it true. She looked toward the seized cask, the Alderton carriage, Hyacinth, and the men who had spoken. I refused to defend him when I did not know. I will not condemn him, now that I do. The silence that followed felt different from the silence at Haverstock, 11 days earlier. Then society had wanted Belinda's good name to make Valentine respectable. Now no one could mistake what she was doing. She was not lending him innocence. She was naming the difference between responsibility and convenience. The older revenue officer turned to Sir Theobald. You will remain available while statements are taken and the seized goods accounted for. The matter will proceed. There was no theatrical arrest, no public sentence delivered on the shingle, yet the change in Theobald's position was unmistakable. The men who had once lowered their eyes before him now looked directly at him. Hyacinth no longer stood where he placed her. His carriage was evidence of his own operation, and the authority he had exercised as a respectable local magistrate could no longer remain untouched by proceedings in which his own conduct was implicated. By midday, word had already begun moving toward households whose invitations and credit he had relied upon. His creditors, long patient because of his apparent standing, would not be patient much longer. Hyacinth would later leave Hampshire to stay with a maternal aunt after giving the fuller statement she had promised. None of that needed to happen instantly to be inevitable. When the officers had finished their first work and the gathered witnesses began dispersing, Belinda walked with Valentine toward the sea wall above the cove. Reverend Sloane remained within sight, speaking to Mr. Hales. For several moments, neither Belinda nor Valentine spoke. The morning light had strengthened. The sea was blue now, almost beautiful enough to insult everything that had happened beside it. Valentine looked at her. You did not save me. No. Thank God. She turned fully toward him. His expression was unguarded. I love you, Belinda. The words came without wit, without flourish. I do not ask you to make me respectable. I ask only whether you can love the man I am choosing to become. Her eyes burned unexpectedly. Belinda held his gaze. I love you too, Valentine. His breath left him as though he had been holding it for weeks. He offered his hand. Belinda placed hers in it and tightened her fingers around his. He held on, not as support this time, not as reassurance borrowed from fear, but as a choice returned freely. Then there is one question left, he said. Only one, for today. A small smile touched his mouth. Belinda, after I have courted you properly, after your father has had every opportunity to decide I am unsuitable, and after you have had every opportunity to agree with him, will you marry me? She laughed through the tears she had refused all morning. Yes. Valentine closed his eyes for one brief second, then looked at her again. He did not kiss her there before the watching shore. He only held her hand more firmly. Yes, yes, Valentine. Below them, revenue men continued their work among the seized casks. Behind them, Sir Theobald's carefully constructed respectability was beginning to collapse beneath the weight of facts he had believed another man's reputation would carry. And beside the sea, Belinda stood hand in hand with the rogue who had finally learned that redemption was not being declared innocent. It was choosing truth when innocence was no longer available. By Sunday, the 17th of August, the sea had lost the grey severity it had worn on the morning Sir Theobald Alderton's scheme collapsed. Under a late summer sky, Norcombe Cove glittered beyond Haverstock's lawns as though nothing dishonest had ever crossed it. Belinda knew better. So did Valentine. That was precisely why neither of them needed the coast to become innocent in order to love it again. Nearly 2 months had passed since the revenue officers intercepted the landing. Sir Theobald's prosecution had proceeded beyond rumour into consequences he could no longer manage with courtesy or influence. Creditors who had once tolerated delay had become less patient once his standing weakened. Invitations ceased. His usefulness as a local magistrate had become untenable, while his own conduct remained under examination. Hyacinth had given the fuller account she had promised, then gone to stay with a maternal aunt outside Hampshire. Belinda had received one letter from her. It contained no request for forgiveness, and no complaint about what truth had cost. Belinda respected her more for both omissions. Mrs. Carter still lived in her cottage. Several fishermen who had once accepted dangerous work because refusal threatened rent, employment, or family had found steadier arrangements through ordinary estate hiring and coastal trades. Valentine had been careful not to call any of it generosity. If a duke neglects his own land long enough for criminals to use it, he had told Mr. Hales, repairing the neglect is administration, not heroism. Belinda had loved him a little more for that sentence, though by then she was already his wife. Their courtship, after the 18th of June, had been neither secret nor hurried. Valentine had called properly. He had endured Reverend Sloane's questions with surprising cheer, and Belinda's with considerably less confidence. 3 Sundays of banns had passed in July. Their marriage had followed lawfully and quietly, with enough witnesses to satisfy society, and too few to turn the day into a performance. Belinda had become Duchess of Norcombe without surrendering the habit of answering when someone called her Miss Sloane by mistake. Valentine had informed her that he found this reassuring. Why? She had asked. Because it means rank has failed to frighten you into becoming someone else. The late summer parish supper at Haverstock was the first large gathering they had hosted since their marriage. Long tables stood along the sea terrace and adjoining lawn. White cloths stirred in the breeze. Children were absent from the formal arrangements, but whole parish households moved comfortably among baskets of bread, cold meats, pies, cheese, and fruit. No one had been invited to celebrate the Duke's redemption. Valentine had forbidden any language remotely resembling it. The gathering existed because summer had been kind. Several boats had returned, with good catches, and Reverend Sloane had suggested that people who had spent months speaking about suspicion might benefit from singing about something else. Belinda stood near the terrace steps in a pale blue gown with no ornament beyond a narrow ribbon at her waist. She could have worn diamonds now. Haverstock contained enough of them to make half the county envious. She preferred being able to turn her head without carrying a chandelier. Valentine approached with 2 glasses of lemonade and offered one. "Your Grace." She accepted it. "Your Grace." His brows lifted. "I see marriage has made us formal. I am practicing for occasions when I must pretend to be impressed by you. Cruelty in a duchess should be regulated. Right to Parliament. They have suffered enough." She laughed and looked toward the lawn. He had been busy all afternoon without making himself the center of anything. He had spoken with fishermen, asked Mr. Hales about repairs to the upper track, thanked Reverend Sloane for organizing the singers, and listened when Mrs. Carter told him one of the estate men had finally repaired her chimney without being reminded twice. The remote cove was now inspected regularly. The boathouse had been secured, its use recorded, and access placed under clear estate oversight. Valentine had not transformed it into a monument to reform. He had simply stopped neglecting it. That mattered to Belinda more than grandeur would have done. Reverend Sloane climbed the 2 shallow steps onto the terrace and clapped his hands once for attention. Before everyone discovers a 3rd helping of pie and becomes impossible to organize, we shall have the singing. A groan of theatrical suffering came from one of the older fishermen. Reverend Sloane pointed at him. "You complained last Sunday that the tenors were weak." "That was before I knew you meant to recruit me, Reverend. Providence is efficient." Laughter moved through the gathering. Belinda watched her father turn toward her. "Belinda, give them the starting note, if you please." Duchess or not, she was still his daughter when parish singers required rescuing from 3 competing keys. Of course. She reached into the small pocket concealed in the folds of her gown and drew out the boxwood pitch pipe that had belonged to her mother. Years of handling had polished one edge smooth. It was plain enough that no stranger would have guessed how much of Belinda's life it carried. Valentine said nothing. He merely watched. She raised the pipe and sounded one clear note. The singers found it. One voice joined, then another, until the first hymn widened across the terrace and lawn. The sound traveled toward the sea, steadier with every measure. Belinda lowered the pitch pipe and returned it safely to her pocket. She felt Valentine beside her before his hand touched nothing at all. He had become very good at waiting. When the verse ended, she turned to him. "My mother always said the first note was only an invitation. One must still choose to sing." Valentine looked toward the parish voices, then back at her. "And have I learned?" Belinda considered him with exaggerated seriousness. "Some things. An encouraging assessment from my wife. You have learned not to perform for the room." His expression softened. "That may be the finest thing anyone has ever said to me. It was not intended as flattery, naturally. Your compliments remain badly disguised corrections. They seem effective." He held out his hand. Belinda placed hers in it without hesitation. Marriage had not made the gesture less meaningful. If anything, it had made choice more visible, because neither of them mistook belonging for ownership. Valentine's fingers closed around hers. "I love you," he said quietly. The words simple now because they no longer had to survive a crisis to be true. Belinda looked at him. "I love you too." Even with Parliament unwritten to. Despite it, the singers began another hymn. For a while they stood side by side, hands joined, watching people who had once looked at Valentine and seen only a rogue, and at Belinda and seen only the vicar's useful daughter. Neither reputation had vanished. Both had simply become too small for the truth. Later, when most of the company had turned towards supper and Reverend Sloane was arguing cheerfully with a churchwarden about whether one pie had been unfairly reserved for the tenors, Belinda drew Valentine a few steps along the terrace. Others remained within sight, though propriety had become a gentler concern now that they were husband and wife. Valentine glanced at her. "Have I committed another administrative failure?" "Not yet. There is time, Valentine." Something in her tone made him quiet. Belinda lifted one hand to his cheek. The gesture surprised him enough that his eyes widened slightly. She enjoyed that more than she should have. You asked permission last time, she said. I remember. Good. Then she rose onto her toes and kissed him. It was brief, tender, and entirely her choice. When she drew back, Valentine looked almost absurdly pleased. I approve of marriage, he said. You were uncertain before. I was uncertain of many things before you. Belinda took his hand again. Behind them, the singers found their harmony, without help. Ahead, the sea darkened toward evening, carrying their voices beyond the terrace and down toward the cove. In Belinda's pocket, her mother's small boxwood pitch pipe rested safe and intact, its work finished for the night. Her free hand remained intertwined with Valentine's, and neither of them needed another person to decide the note they would choose next.